Welcome, this is Information Service Engineering, lecture number 1, Natural Language Processing. This is part 2, Language and Understanding. In this part of the lecture, you will learn what language is and that it's required to understand language to get to the information which is hidden inside the message that is delivered by use of the language. Okay, so let's start. We are looking at the communication process where, of course, language is involved. We have to clarify what is communication. According to Merriam-Webster's, communication is a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through common systems of symbols, signs, or behavior. So these kind of common systems of symbols, signs, and behavior, of course, characterize what is language. Also, if you look at the Wikipedia definition, you see communication is the act of conveying intended meaning from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs and semiotic rules. Don't worry about semiotic rules. These are rules that tell you how to interpret these signs. So this is semiotics. So the communication process, usually you have some information in your brain that has to be encoded in terms of language, which will be passed from one sender to a receiver who has to decode the message from the language to get to the intended meaning of the sender. And in the course of this part of the lecture, we will see how this process really works and what components are required really to understand the intended meaning of a message. Okay, so what is language? Language is a system of conventionally spoken, manual or written symbols, so also manual symbols, think of sign language, by means of which human beings as members of a social group and participants in its culture express themselves. So language is used to express something. And of course the function of language includes communication, which is the main purpose we are focusing here. Also the expression of identity, play, imaginative expression and emotional release. But we will focus on communication in a language. And since this course or this part of the course is entitled Natural Language Processing, we are interested in natural languages, of course. How are natural languages communicated? First, of course, by speaking, so the act of speech. And therefore, of course, the receiver is listening and the sender is speaking. But this is not the only way to communicate language. Of course, we also know that language can be conveyed by textual messages. And there, the sender is writing and the receiver is reading the message. So this is the act of communication via natural language. Okay, let's have a closer look at these natural languages. How are they encoded? Usually, in the Western world, we have some kind of alphabetic writing systems, which means a single character there refers to a single sound. So this is a kind of phonemic alphabet that we are using. When you go to other countries, for example, in the Middle East, there you also have consonant alphabets, so-called abjads. And there the vowels can be deduced from the context from the given consonants. But these are all kind of alphabetic writing systems. But they are not the only writing systems, of course. If you go further east, you are then in the Asian world, for example. There you have syllabic systems and also logographic systems. What does that mean? A syllabic system also involves the mapping between characters and sound, but of course not only on a single piece of sound, on larger fractions, on larger units. And a logograph, usually that's a symbol which represents an entire unit of meaning. So not only one single character, but an entire word, for example, or even more, all put into a logograph, which is something like a fancy picture of the action it encodes. So these are kind of writing systems and encoding systems for natural language. And of course, now you might ask also, if there are natural languages, are there also artificial languages? Yes, of course, there are. And all of you who know how to program or have ever written a program in some programming language, they know some artificial language. Like, for example, here you see the example of some Java code. Okay, so now we know a bit about the act of communication and about the means of communication, which is language. Now let's go back to information which is conveyed via language in the act of communication. So what is information? I mean, a simple definition is information is that which informs. Then we have to think of, okay, what does it mean to inform? So what really is information? So information is conveyed as the content of a message. So information somehow is the content which is expressed with the help of language. And it can be encoded in various forms for transmission and interpretation. So I can speak language or I can write language, for example. And of course, information in a physical sense is any kind of propagation of cause and effect within a system. So it does not necessarily depend on natural language. Information is any kind of the propagation of cause and effect. So no matter if I push something and then on the other side something will happen, I have passed some information with that. And another interesting thing is that the existence of information is not necessarily bound or coupled to an observer. It's simply there, no matter whether somebody really is observing this act of communication or not. But from, let's say, a statistical point of view and from point of information theory, the most important definition of information is that information reduces uncertainty. What does that mean? Just simple, the more information you have, the more certain you are about the fact and the information that is communicated. So less information, more insecurity, more information, more security, more certainty. So this is somehow the way how information theory is defining information, and this is also the definition of information. We will later on, when we construct language model for natural language processing, will take care of and focus on. Okay, now we have information, and now the question is, what does it mean to understand the information? Usually, let's say in our own words, understanding is somehow the ability to grasp the meaning of information. But of course we have to define this somehow in a more formal way. We know that information is conveyed in a message using a specific language. So now, to understand information, the receiver of this message has to interpret the information correctly that he receives. So understanding always is the correct interpretation of the meaning of a message. So this is really important if you define what it means, how information is understood. But we will get back to this later. Now, for the correct interpretation of the meaning, we need some other factors involved. So we have to think of syntax, which means or which defines how to form, how to represent a message. We have to think about semantics, the meaning. We have to about the context, the circumstances of the symbols that are gathered in my message. We have to think about the pragmatics, which is somehow the intended meaning of the sender. And of course, also the correct interpretation depends on my personal experience, so the experience of the receiver. Let's have a closer look on exactly these expressions, starting with the syntax. Syntax comes from the Greek. It means something like arrangement and ordering. And in the science of grammatics, syntax denotes the study of the principles and processes by which sentences in a language are constructed. In the science of formal languages, their syntax is just a set of rules by which well-formed expressions, that's how they are called, can be created from a fundamental set of symbols, which is usually an alphabet. So formal languages, their language or syntax defines the rules how you form a well-formed expression. And in computer science, syntax defines usually the so-called normative structure of data. So syntax is usually responsible for forming well-formed expression to form correct sentences within a language without looking at the meaning. Now the meaning comes into play when we look into semantics. Semantics is also a word which comes from the Greek, and this means, in translation, it pertains to the character, or it's the study of meaning. Semantics as itself, it's part of linguistics, and it's focused on the sense and meaning of language and the symbols of a language. And usually then it's the study of the interpretation of these signs or symbols as used by agents or communities within particular circumstances and contexts. Usually semantics asks how sense and meaning of complex concepts can be derived from simple concepts based on a set of rules. And these rules, this is the funny thing in semantics, these rules are syntactic rules which are then applied. But to get semantics right, you need to look at context and pragmatics. This means semantics of a message depends on context and pragmatics. First, have a look at the context. Context means, this is a word which comes from Latin now, contextus means interweaved. Context denotes the surrounding of a symbol in an expression, respective its relationship with surrounding expressions and further related elements. So then usually context denotes all elements of any sort of communication that define the interpretation of the communicated content, which means, for example, the surrounding words, but also the way how, for example, the language is used in the act of speaking. This also is part of the context. But to really interpret it, to get the meaning right, we also have to know the intention of the sender of the message. And this is the so-called pragmatics. Again, a word from Greek, which means action. And this reflects exactly the intention by which the language is used to communicate a message. In the science of linguistics, pragmatics denotes usually the study of applying language in different situations, and it denotes the intended purpose of the speaker, as we have already said. So it studies the ways in which context contributes to meaning. So whether I speak loud, whether I speak low, whether I speak with determination or stuff like that, or whether I'm sarcastic. So this all is involved in the interpretation of pragmatics. And of course, then this somehow influences the meaning of the conveyed message. And on the other hand, I also have to look at the situation of the receiver. There, the experience is the most important thing, and it considers usually all information that you as a receiver have learned and put in context with the world you are living in. So usually in that sense, experience can also be related to what is called common sense knowledge or world knowledge. So this is really important for interpreting somehow the message in a correct way and to simply see whether the message is understood in the correct way. So all these parts come into play when it comes to the correct interpretation of meaning. Let's have, to sum up all these concepts, a look at the so-called process of successful communication. When is communication successful? For this, first of all, the information has to be correctly transmitted. So this relies usually on the use of syntax. But not only that, then the semantics of the transmitted information must be interpreted correctly. So this, of course, depends on how to deal with semantics. And there, then, understanding depends on the context of both, of sender and receiver, as well as on the pragmatics of the sender. But therefore also personal experience is involved in the end. So this personal experience determines how sender and receiver interpret the semantics, the context, as well as the pragmatics of a message, and thus its intended meaning. You see, it's not so easy really to interpret information correctly. And as you know from your daily life, of course, you do not always understand what somebody who is speaking to you really means. So then you ask back and ask for more information to understand it better. And there you see again the concept of information related to information science. The more information you get, this information then either emphasizes, for example, a specific interpretation, or doesn't emphasize and switches the meaning somehow to another interpretation. So therefore, information means, of course, the level of uncertainty within a message. Okay, to come to an end, if we look at the process of successful communication, there, of course, this semiotic triangle of understanding always is involved. So this is the semiotic triangle according to Ogden Richards, which was developed in the 1920s, but its original concepts date back to Aristotle. So how does it work? Usually we transmit something like a symbol. Here, for example, we transmit the symbol jaguar. But the problem is, what does it mean? Is it the car? Is it the cat? Is it the operating system? No idea. So if I speak this symbol, if you hear that symbol, usually then some concept arises in your mind. And of course, this kind of concept refers to an object in the real world. Also, the symbol that you use stands for an object in the real world that you denote by using exactly or speaking or writing that symbol. The important point is that successful communication only can take place when both sender and receiver use the same concept for the symbol. Only then, of course, the semantics is interpreted correctly. Only then the information can be understood, which is the essence of exactly that part of the lecture. So this concludes the second part of the lecture, and in the next part of the lecture you will learn more about natural language processing techniques and challenges.